Would you talk a little bit briefly about your work in the fall, and then we'll talk about the oral history interviews themselves.
This is okay. It works. So my work during the fall was a bit challenging, to say the least, just because it during that time it has been a while since I did like any research in like, especially during this really crucial time period, and so I had to really get used to researching through like important emblems throughout this time period, such as ACT UP, learning like what is ACT UP, learning what is GMHC, even Salsa Soul Sisters. I had to get into that mindset of like understanding what their commitment was, what they were doing, and yeah, in general, it was more about understanding their perspective during that time period, and really trying to grasp the importance of it all, really.
Hello, this works. Yeah, my experience, I would say, was very similar. It was the first time that I was exposed to such like detailed like documents, and it was really exciting, like diving into everything. But it was also very like heartbreaking just seeing how widespread the stigma like of AIDS was back then. Particularly when we were reading the collection of the New York human rights material, when we read about how there was this one individual who visited his friends in the AIDS ward at the hospital, and he was fired the following day. And there was a lot of documentation on people who were denied housing just because they were assumed to be queer. That was really heartbreaking for me personally, just reading about that. And also when we read some of the personal essays of people who had AIDS and their experience during that time, and when we read about Ryan White, the 13-year-old from Indiana he contracted AIDS through an IV infusion, and he faced a lot of discrimination when he went back to school. Yeah, so it was just tough reading those stories.
Hi, hello? Hi, I want to say that like it was pretty eye-opening experience to look at all these documents and read everything that was involved. Like it said, like the Human Rights Commission, I still think about the stories that were read about them and how deeply this affected people who were not just queer, but also who just even to be perceived as queer, which was really heartbreaking because there's really no room for it, and the fact that it was just so widespread all over in every area of life, from healthcare to housing to just basic ways of living. I specifically think about this one case where this man's therapist dropped him because he didn't support his lifestyle, and how he was exposing, to the therapist, he was exposing himself, which was utterly heartbreaking to hear, and just so many stories about these people and just how much they overcame, which was incredibly enlightening to read now, which I'm really grateful for, and having the experience to read these firsthand documents and stories.
Thank you for your recollections. It was an intense period of immersing ourselves in these archival sources, trying to make sense of this really complicated matter, and it was great to engage in conversation with you. Marjorie, early on, before it was even called AIDS, it was often referred to as GRID, and I think you first became aware of GRID through a story about your friend Lorraine, who you went to college with in Staten Island, in fact. Would you reflect about these early days and Lorraine's illness in particular?
Well, I guess first I want to say it's really a pleasure being here, and I just want to give a big shout out to the students and the work that they did. History is incredibly important, and I think there's an expression, those who don't pay attention to it are doomed to repeat the errors of the history. And so it's really, really important. And a time when currently history is not only not being valued, but it's being like recreated. I mean, it's like crazy. So this has always been important, but I just want to say what you're doing now is critically important. I grew up in New York, and I just want to give another shout out, and then I'll stop. Shout outs. I am a proud graduate of a sister school to LaGuardia, Staten Island Community. Okay, and so, at a time when, in New York, yeah, Staten Island is part of New York. But at a time when education is not really as widespread, open, and available as it should be, being able to go wherever you can and however you can. And sometimes sister colleges and sometimes sisters and brothers don't necessarily appreciate community college. And I am in large measure successful in terms of my academic career because of the people who invested in me in community college. And Steve is someone who invests in the students in a very real way. And you can't put a price on that. So I just want to say congratulations and thank you. So back to Lorraine. Hey, buddy. Good to see you. So I don't even remember what year it was. I went to, as I said, Staten Island Community and met my friend, a best friend that we're still friends, Sharon. And Sharon and Lorraine and I were 3 friends, and I went to Adelphi, Sharon went to Fairleigh Dickinson, and Lorraine went out to California to marry her high school sweetheart. And Lorraine, we all lost touch, and then one day Sharon calls me up and she said, "Girl, guess who got the AIDS?" No, actually, it wasn't. "Guess who got GRID?" And I said, "Who? Wait a minute, GRID, what are you talking about?" She said, "Lorraine." I said, "Lorraine can't have GRID. She's not gay. What are you talking about?" I mean, this is, okay? And I went to see her. I hadn't seen her maybe in 4 or 5 years, to Brooklyn Hospital. And I arrived, it's the first time I've ever gone to see someone with communicable disease. And I get there, and I go to the room, and there's this big, X on the door, "Do not enter, go to the nurse's station." So I go to the nurse's station, and they glove me, gown me. I mean, they do everything but put a spacesuit on me so I could go in. And on the way in, I took off my mask because, I mean, it's kind of stupid in retrospect, but I didn't want Lorraine to feel like I thought she was contagious, right? I wanted her to at least be able to see my face. In retrospect, I'm the one with the germs, right? I should, that I should be keeping to myself. But it was just an awakening. Here I am. I must have been, I don't know, maybe I had graduated from college, maybe. So I wasn't a child, but this was this new thing. And I just always remember going to see her and what that was like. And while we've come a long, long, long way, unfortunately, there's still, even now, stigma that gets kind of perpetrated, whether it's AIDS or it's race or it's gender or transphobia, but it still exists and keeps people from getting the help that they need, getting the support that they need. And so, I lost Lorraine, we lost Lorraine, but her story stayed with me throughout as I got involved in HIV, when I went to GMHC, when I worked for City, when I worked for the Workers' Compensation Board. I mean, it just became an issue of thinking about everyone deserves the right to be treated with respect.
Thank you, Marjorie. Thank you, students. Tom, welcome. Delighted to see you. I gave the audience a brief overview of the exhibit inspired by your collection and brought them through it. And really thrilled, honored to have you here. Your career is just remarkable in the work you've done at the grassroots level as a community leader in Chelsea, going back to the 70s and 80s, as district leader, as a member of ACT UP, and a city council member and ultimately state senator. Your advocacy, really inspiring. One thing that struck me, and Sophia led the interview of you, as you recall, was when you ran for city council in 1991, and you announced your HIV positive status. And would you take us through this moment? It's deeply personal against the backdrop of this race for city council against Liz Abzug. You ultimately prevailed in District 3 in Lower Manhattan. Your decision to disclose publicly your HIV positive status and the impact that it had. Because we're talking about stigma, and this helps reduce the stigma when we can have these open conversations. And this is a really pioneering, important moment in my view. Would you talk a little bit about that moment?
Sure. I actually ran for the city council in 1989, and I had just gotten my results of an HIV test that was from 1985, but I believe I was positive before that. But because it had just been confirmed, there would be a lot of people to tell, and for whatever reason, and it's just as well, I lost that race, but I decided I wanted to do it again. And I made up my mind that I was going to disclose my HIV status, so I set in motion things so that there'd be no way that I couldn't be open about my HIV status. So like I joined the HIV caucus of ACT UP. I told more and more people. I'm a person in recovery. I went to a special meeting for people with HIV in recovery. So it became rather widely known. And then I made up my mind to do it. And I remember my then campaign consultant, when I told him what I was planning on doing, I thought he was going to have a heart attack. And I couldn't talk about this at the time because it sounded sort of craven, possibly, but there was really no point in running and disclosing and not winning. So I did everything I possibly could to win. I had enough volunteers that we did polling, and we asked a couple questions about HIV/AIDS, including did people know someone who had it or who had passed away from it, and then we focus grouped it. I know. If only I get my hands on those tapes. I didn't watch the focus groups, but apparently what happened, and I have to give a huge shout out to someone named Brian Coyle, who was a Minneapolis city councilor, who announced while he was in office that he had AIDS. And the way he disclosed it, and I had heard about that, I called him and I asked him for help. I knew him from sort of a gay elected officials network. And I said, how did you do it? And he said, I had a TV group, camera crew following me around for like one of the local news stations, and also like what would be their New York magazine in Minneapolis follow me around, and it was sort of like portrayed as a day in the life of, and they embargoed it till a certain date, and they were going to at the same time release it to the public, air on television, and the magazine article was gonna come out, and he said, my constituents who I represent, they need to hear it from me personally. So he said, I sat down and I wrote a letter and I sent it out to the people in my district. And I was like, that's great. So I was most grateful to him for telling me about that. And so we focus grouped in two ways: a candidate announcing their HIV status, would you vote for them or not, and a professor who was up for tenure and whether or not they should tell the department head. So those two scenarios were put forward so people wouldn't, kind of get the idea of what it was really about. And what happened was, for the election part of it, older people whose hobby it is voting, I don't know whether you know that or not, but the older you are, the more likely it is you're going to vote. They all said, no politician would ever do that, but of course I'd vote for them. Now, all the gay men said, oh, he should never do that. He shouldn't tell anybody. but I'd already made up my mind to do it. So, who knew how it was going to play? But I had a lot of faith in the people who lived in my district, and I did end up winning that case. But it was huge. At the time, the city council expanded from 35 to 51 for reasons which those of you who take New York City, government history, which I used to teach, but we won't go into that now. Where was I going with that? There was nothing else happening in New York City. It was one of those off years. Every 4 years, there's like nothing happening because the state legislature is on the even years 2 years, so is Congress. And the city is usually once every 4 years, the mayor and the council. But this was an in-between year. So there was nothing happening in New York but these races for these new council seats. And ours was the most famous because Liv Zug is still a lesbian and was out about that. Of course, I was already openly gay for forever. And it was just a huge story. I mean, it was like a national story, and it was like even in the International Herald Tribune. And I wanted to be running like a small little local race, a little council race, and we had to like bat away, press because I wanted to, just be a regular candidate. Anyway, I love my constituents. They elected me, and the one thing that, I told a lot of people, not among the first people were my parents. And when I told them about my HIV status, they said, "Don't tell anyone." And I was like, well, I'm going to be telling everyone. But it was, and I was elected. There was another openly gay person elected to the city council. He was the anti-crime gay. I was the gay. But right when I started, the chair of the health committee was quoted in the paper as saying that he believed that gay rights caused AIDS. And I heard about that. I was actually on my way to visit the Museum of Natural History when I got a call about it. And I knew this was going to be quite a day. So when I got back down to City Hall, at the time, actually, Peter Vallone was the speaker, and I think he convinced, it was Enoch Williams, I think God rest his soul, who he convinced to change his position, which he said he would, and then at a press conference, he changed back again. And so there was who knew that was the first? This is who I am. I'm a really nice guy, right? I am, but don't let that fool you. Don't make me mad. And that made me mad. And what happened was I made a floor on the speech of the council about my HIV status, and how dare you kick people when they're down, because people were still dying. There was no. People were able to stay alive maybe for a couple of years, but there was no cure. There's still no cure. There weren't even very good treatments. So I made a very angry speech on the floor of the council, and people then knew not to mess with me anymore. And people got to know me just as a regular person, but there was some stigma, but it was greatly diminished. And it did, if you ever want to see, there was no C-SPAN in the council. There was no C-SPAN when I started in the Senate. There was right towards the end. So if you ever want to see me angry, if you go on YouTube and you look at Tom Duane 30% rent cap, you will see the speech that I wanted to make for the first 10 years that I was in the state Senate. And it's not unlike the speech that I made in the city council, or when I was able to pass hate crimes because I had been the survivor of a hate crime, rather vicious hate crime attack. So, if you got it, use it, and I did. But there was still tremendous stigma then. In fact, if you went to visit someone in the hospital and you brought them food, and usually if it's a fruit basket or whatever. Whatever's not eaten, you give it to the nurses. Well, they would not touch it. Like, you might as well just throw it out. And that's how it was then. And I'll wait for some more questions. But you might ask, why did I do that? Why did I announce my HIV status? Because I felt like I was called to do it. Like, going into politics, it's like going into public service, I had no choice. It was just where I was going. It's like a vocation to be a priest. And I also use it when people want to join the police force. They're called to do that. They want to get the bad guy, they want to keep people safe. It was not originally my intention to run for public office, but my community activism, led me to do that. And I had this, not just being openly gay, but this, extra thing about me. And I decided that I was going to do my best to use it for good. Before I was elected, though, I don't know whether you cover this, one of the things I am most proud of ever is something called brashi. Do you know what brashi is? So when people were dying really quickly, in rent-regulated apartments, if the person who died, if their name was on the lease, their partner, their non-traditional family member, was not allowed to succeed to the apartment, which meant the landlord would be there, nailing an eviction notice at the door. The family of the deceased person could come and take everything out of the apartment. And so in 1986, a legal aid attorney by the name of Russell Pierce called and asked me if I would help do the organizing, not the legal part, but the organizing part, which I did. And most of the gay civil rights organizations said, absolutely don't do it, you're going to create bad case law. This is one of those things, when they say, no, you can't possibly do it, because you know what? Most of the time you'll win. And I was like, well, they're getting thrown out anyway, how bad could the case law be? And we fought it, and by 1989, the courts, the state's highest court ruled in favor of non-traditional family members could succeed to rent-regulated apartments. And it not only helped people whose partners had died because of AIDS, but also like two disabled people might not want to get married because they would lose benefits. So there's lots of reasons why people decide not to get married. It doesn't mean they're not family. And I won't make any comments about, polyamorous relationship, but I mean, the Golden Girls, who could deny that they're not family, right? I mean, we get to create our own families, and that's what this is all about. And eventually they did make a whole group of regulations of which, you had a pet together, they're super new, you had magazine subscriptions, a joint checking account. You know what checks are? There's this thing they used to have called checks. Anyway, there are all these things. The one thing they could not ask was whether or not you were having sex, and I love that about this bill. So, because, sometimes when you've been with someone a long time, that kind of slows down. But anyway, but there are real reasons why people live together, and we should get to choose who we want to live with and who our family members are.
Our interview with Tom was especially long. The Brashi case, the New York State Court concluded that same-sex relationships were entitled to legal recognition. This was a milestone that ultimately paved the way in New York State for the recognition of same-sex marriage in 2011. So when you study same-sex marriage at the state level, you have to go back to Brashi.
And it was used for adoption, that the non-biological parent could now adopt the child of the biological parent. That was done in circuits court based on Brashi. So it was a stepping stone towards full recognition.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tom. I want to return to the students. We did archival research in the fall. You never feel totally prepared for this. There's always more to read, more to think about, more to talk about. We know that. We did started oral history interviews in the spring. Again, another great challenge, another research methodology. And I would like, the students conducted multiple interviews with both our panelists. Would you talk a little bit about your experience doing oral history interviews, just the preparation, anything particularly memorable about it, the experience? And let's start this time with Isabella, go to Sophia, and then Matthew.
much fun and it was a very insightful skill learning project. And specifically the interviews with Ronald Johnson and Katie Thomas, I had just a lot of insightfulness, I guess, with the experience talking to them and learning their very different perspectives on what they lived through and their very extraordinary lived experiences and how they help their communities. With Katie in specific, it was really, as I mentioned before, one of my favorite research that we conducted was on the Human Rights Commission, and speaking to someone who directly worked with that was absolutely outstanding, and just seeing someone who experienced that firsthand was really, really great, and I'm very grateful that I was able to do it and conduct these interviews. Yeah.
Let's see if this mic will turn on. Hello, hello. Okay, so for me, the interviews were my favorite part. As the president mentioned, I'm a sociology and anthropology nerd. So being able to meet people who were trailblazers and are the reason why certain people have rights today because of them, meeting them in person for me felt like a dream. This is my first internship ever. This is my first time being in a panel doing any of this. And the fact that I got to meet people like Duane, and Bernard Lynch and Patrick McGovern and Charles King, right off the bat, it felt surreal. I'm gonna go into a little bit of a thing here, but what stood out to me most about this entire experience was that the AIDS crisis was never just a medical crisis. It was a social, political, and civil rights and educational struggle. And the fight was brought forward by people who cared about their community, people who noticed that there were things going on that were not right, and they felt a calling, as you said. And the fact that for example, when you told your parents about your diagnosis and they said, don't tell anyone, the average person would not tell someone and they would just sit with that. But you broke free from that, and now we're here years later, and now we can do even better things because of that. And just to be able to talk to you and sit here, that is so inspiring to me also as a young person who does community organizing. And yeah, it just really reminded me that we have the power to change, and it can start small, but it can have a huge impact. And that to me, I will take that with me with everything that I'm doing forward, in my future and with my career. And I feel I couldn't have stumbled upon a better opportunity. So I'm very, very grateful.
For me, interviewing was such a great experience because, and I want to give a shout out to Dr. Marjorie Hill, because I did interview her. And it was such a pleasure in meeting her, interviewing her, because with all of my interviews, I kept in mind that the people that came before me, that sacrificed, their livelihoods to get the resources that we have now, I really put a lot of thought into that when I was interviewing them, because it really shows the progressional point and where we are now as the community, as my community, LGBTQ community, that how much we, soared through and how much we gone through. And so I kept that in mind a lot of the times when I was interviewing, and overall, it was great to get their perspective, to understand their struggles, to understand their insights of everything that happened during that time period. And yeah, overall, researching, it was challenging but rewarding to really get into, the raw stories that happened, all of that. So overall, I'm really grateful to be part of this project and to really put this, as a core memory for the community.
Charles King, Bernard Lynch, and Patrick McGovern all did ministry work, and hearing their experience, very intimate experience with working with people who are about to reach the end of their life. And Bernard Lynch said that the most important thing that he learned was to not bullshit somebody, like when they're in that situation. And he also, another thing about him that really stood out to me that I really admire, he is still Catholic despite being his father was like revoked when they found out that he was part of the LGBT community, and he still practices Catholicism, but just not in the Catholic Church. And I just, like, everyone that I interviewed was so complex. Like, they went through something that, like, you guys are probably the only people who have, like, ever gone through this. You guys are, like, history, like, right here, you know, in front of us. And, like, there's just, like, a certain level of, like, emotional intelligence that you have to have, and care for others to be able to do what you guys did. And also, my favorite thing about the interviews was when you guys recall your experiences. Your own reflection was very fascinating to me, and how you told the stories, and how you think about things with what you know now, and how I just can't get over how, Tom, you're like, I don't know why I did it, but I just felt like I had to, and now, like, we're here because of that. It's just so fascinating to me, and very inspirational.
Thank you. Thank you so much for all that you've done. Talk about work in the public sector, mobilizing resources, organizing the community. Marjorie, you made the leap into government in 1990 during the administration of Mayor David Dinkins. You were appointed director of the mayor's office for the lesbian and gay community. It was an interesting transition in your professional career. Would you reflect a little bit about your work in the Dinkins administration in this capacity?
So Mayor David Dinkins was an incredible person, leader, politician, advisor, and when he was elected, you know, the city, or many of us were very excited, and at the time I had served on a board, the North Star Fund. It was the first board I actually served on, and we were providing money to primarily grassroots organizations, many of whom it was their first grant. And I sort of represented LGBT issues. Victor Quintana represented either housing or community organizing. And Victor became Mayor Dinkins' Director of Community Affairs. So Victor calls me, we had served on the board together, and he said, oh, Marjorie, how you doing? You know, and I said, congratulations. And so Victor said, so the mayor is looking for someone to run the office for the guest, I can't even say it, lesbian and gay community. And I said, so where do I send my resume? Drop the mic, complete silence. So I'm like, okay, so now I have to take my size 10 out of my mouth. And I said, well, Victor, is there something wrong? And he says, well, you know, Dr. Hill, I called you because I know you know the community and you might, you know, be able to suggest someone. I said, well, Mr. Quintana, you didn't call me asking for a therapy referral. You know, you asked me about organizing, and, you know, because at that point I had already done it. Now, I just have to say, I had never done that in my life, and I got the job, okay? So, I mean, part of the moral to that story is go after what you want, you know? I mean, it's either yes or no. I mean, go after it. But it was an incredibly exciting opportunity to be thrust into this position where, you know, you're like the city lesbian. And people said to my mother, they said, so what does she do? She goes to meetings and she organizes. That's what my mother said. She still says that. But it was incredibly wonderful, and what was one of the most wonderful things about it is that, because everybody says this about their boss, right? But he really believed in that beautiful mosaic with the lavender tiles. I mean, he really really believed in it. And so the only thing I had to do was argue for time. I didn't have to argue for principles, you know? And it was, you know, I mean, St. Patrick's Day marching was not my idea. I was probably one of them gays that said, no, stay home. But he really felt the injustice of having a parade and having Irish people not be a part of it. How crazy is that? And how crazy is it that that was an issue? And I remember, and last thing I'll say, it's about the stigma at the time. I was walking between, like, I want to say, Brian McGillicuddy and Annie O'Shaughnessy, right? I'm walking down the street, and the mayor's all the way in the front of the contingent, and we're kind of, you know, in the back. But it's that one contingent that we were in, and there was these two little old ladies that, you know, looked like they could have been Annie O'Brien's grandmother. And they looked at us and they said, you should all die of AIDS. Now that's a horrible thing to say. It's a horrible thing to think. And as horrified as I felt, I couldn't even feel so horrified about it because I felt so bad for Brian and Anna, right? And I thought if I was in the African American Day Parade and somebody who looked like my grandmother was on the sidelines and said, you should all die of it. I mean, it was horrific. But I just held their arm tighter and I said, you're with the mayor's girls. So, you know, it just was an incredible time when truth and justice seemed to matter, that values seemed to matter, that the community seemed to matter. And the mayor, I never had to convince him about, well, there was one thing. He wasn't all that crazy about syringe exchange. That I did have to convince him. Deborah Fraser House, I'm trying to think who else. There were like 3 or 4 of us who sat down because, and it wasn't a gay thing, right? It wasn't a, it was just that in the era that he grew up in, you don't give people drugs. He had seen many people in the black community and other communities die, so he just had to be convinced. But when we brought him the science, he said, okay. So.
Mayor Dinkins and the marchers, you probably experienced this too. I mean, people were throwing beer cans into the group as we walked along, and it was, I mean, the mayor was amazing about that. I remember the next day we were so appreciative. He went down to Sheridan Square and did an Irish jig with some of the Irish people there. He was terrific. And I also want to say, Marjorie is only talking about the good parts of her job. It was never enough for us queers. And Marjorie had to like put up with that we were demanding things more and faster, and Marjorie had to like listen to us do that, and she was the target. So, but it did survive and be tougher because of that. And so I have to say now, I'm sure I was one of the terrible people that did that, grateful, but also never enough. So for all the terrible things I did because it was never enough, I am sorry.
I think that the issue around advocacy is that there are difficult moments. And sometimes the most difficult moments happen. What's that Bible verse? My mother's gonna love this. Like a prophet isn't welcome in their own country or something like that. Yeah. You know, but sometimes the most difficult moments do come from, you know, your peers. I'm sure, because I heard some people say, Tom is crazy. He gonna tell people, yeah, we already know, but why you gotta tell people? But you know, sometimes you have to stand up with and for and in opposition to the people you love. Because I believe that most people, given the chance, will come around. And sometimes people need longer than others. Some.
Thank you, Marjorie. Thank you, Marjorie. Yeah, the 1991 St. Patrick's Day Parade, when Mayor Dinkins, Marjorie, and others marched with ILGO, the Irish Lesbian Gay Organization, was momentous. As you say, beer cans were being thrown at them. Mayor Dinkins compared it to Birmingham 1963, the battles over desegregation. That's how just really the rhetoric, as you say, and the clashes, and it led to the banning of LGBTQ groups from the St. Patrick's Day for 25 years, until 2016, and Tom and others like Brendan Fay protested the ban, were often arrested, engaged in civil disobedience. We, in fact, developed curriculum on this very subject. It's on our website, so I have to mention that. Tom, and also I want to talk the evolution of attitudes, and that's what's interesting, I think, about this exhibit, Marjorie, is that people, it takes time, it takes more evidence, it takes moral suasion, it takes pressure, it takes advocacy, it takes actions to make change, and that's one lesson learned here. And there's often going to be resistance. Tom, you worked in city council with Mayor Dinkins and then Mayor Giuliani. Mayor Giuliani, elected in '93, took office in '94, threatened to cut the Division of AIDS Services. This was an ongoing battle. You led city council in response to this threat to cut the DAS, and it ultimately became HASA. Would you take us back to these days? And there's a photo, you missed it when the introduction, I showed a photo of a protest on the steps of City Hall protesting against Giuliani's threat to cut DAS. Could you take us back to this moment when you were battling the Giuliani administration, you and your colleagues in City Council?
Well, Mayor Giuliani, it's a stretch to say that I worked with him. Although occasional moments, maybe with his commissioners. Originally, he said, well, people are unhappy with DAS. It's just not working that well, and the clients are complaining, so let's just get rid of it. Well, that's not what we wanted at all. We wanted it to be better. So then he was like, well, we'll reform it. And there was a particular deputy mayor that he put in charge of reforming it, which was just another word for eliminating it. And there was an enormous outcry, and there was a coalition put together. Now, Mayor Giuliani had been elected with the support of what was then the Liberal Party, don't let the name fool you, and which was always for sale, so you could buy it. And it wasn't that he cared about people with AIDS, it's just that people that consider themselves sort of liberal, white people on the Upper West Side was like, ugh, that's terrible, he's gonna cut services for people with AIDS? That's why he did it, because he was gonna lose their support. That's really what drove it. But ultimately, I'll give you an example of, when I had been in the council for about a year, Peter Vallone, who is a Queens, and I would say a conservative, very religious Democrat, it's like a beautiful moment. He called me into his office, and he said to me, you've really changed a lot of minds around here, he said. And then he gave me a holy card. It was like one of the greatest moments of my life. But ultimately, I was able to get every member of the city council, Democrats and Republicans, to oppose any cuts to the Division of AIDS Services, and it eventually led to being able to enshrine the HASA in law, so it cannot be undone, and it's like the role model for the best possible kind of social services you could have ever. But there is no substitute for a seat at the table. And, I'm a nice guy, just don't make me mad. And they were angry along with me about cuts to AIDS services, and it led to this terrible thing he tried to do. Well, it backfired, and it became one of the best things to help people living with HIV and AIDS that happened probably in the country, so.
Thank you, Tom. And photos from your collection really illustrate this narrative, so we appreciate, again, your collection. great historic photos and great contemporary photos. I see my colleague Maureen Drennan here, whose students were out in the field and they took photos of the AIDS Memorial downtown, the center on West 13th Street, Housing Works, the original location of GMHC. So thank you, Maureen, and your students. They're featured in this exhibit as well. I wanted to go to Marjorie, Tom, briefly, and then give the students the last word, running a little bit over, and then open it to audience Q&A a little bit. Marjorie, you, as President Adams indicated in his introduction, you also spent many years with GMHC, staff member, board member, ultimately CEO. Would you reflect briefly about your time at GMHC, the significance of this organization, and the services provided to HIV positive people, people living with AIDS?
Well, you know, there are many wonderful things about GMHC, and some of them may be surprising. For example, GMHC had the first lesbian AIDS project in the country. And the meals program was phenomenal. I mean, it was not, meals are important, but there was a philosophy that they should be hot meals. And so we went to great lengths to maintain that. And I think that what was always interesting and may still be interesting about GMHC was the tension and partnership between compassion and service and advocacy, right? And so even in the very beginning, you know, there were people who wanted to help people die with dignity. I mean, because there was really nothing could be done in the early days, and there were people who wanted to go raise hell about those people dying. And the truth of the matter is that we need to do both, and everything in between. But at the after the first year, the more advocacy arm of GMHC, led by Larry, bless his heart, may he rest. And he did a lot of wonderful things there and after, left and formed ACT UP. And then the more clinically oriented clinically oriented social service people then began to really expand services. And, you know, like I said, we need them both. But that tension existed then, and I think there's still some of it that remains. But I remember once I was in the, David Webpern was finance chair, and, you know, every year all the organizations go to, you know, make their requests. And Janet Weinberg, very dear friend of mine, was the chief development officer. So the two of us go to David Webpern, and we're sitting there. And this is someone who's, you know, pretty knowledgeable about health and public health. And he said, I don't get it. GMHC sends 2 women. And I'm like, oh boy, no, you don't get it. Okay, so this is gonna take a minute. But you know, the beauty of it was that he could say it, and we could hear it, and, you know, not say, oh, what an idiot. You know, because it wasn't really, it was, you know, sometimes when you don't know, you don't know. And if you can't say, you're not gonna know. And so GMHC gave many opportunities for people to grow and learn and expand. And I would say that's true for people in the gay and lesbian community, as well as for people, you know, who are not gay and lesbian. I mean, I think that was the beauty of it. I would say that my consciousness as a public health person was really formed at GMHC, because if you had a sniffle, you didn't come to work. I mean, that was just understood. And why? Because there were some people who were out about their HIV status, but not everyone. And so we just had to presume that we had a lot of individuals who were immunocompromised. And so you think you're catching a cold, stay your ass home. Mm-hmm. And you know, I've had, when I was CEO, I had people who asked me, well, do you ever feel like people took advantage of it. I said, well, no, but I mean, maybe they did, but the truth of the matter was the value was about respect of health care and health status, you know, the thing that, you know, people were so offended by during the COVID pandemic, that we should care about, controlling being public health. So, I mean, GMHC, I think one of the mottos was first in the fight, and, you know, it continues. You know, it continues to fight and be visible. I mean, we just had AIDS Walk, was a month ago, a well-established New York City tradition. So.
The disease has morphed. It's really a disease of poverty and stigma now, more than any other populations, I think.
It is indeed ongoing, though we end our exhibit roughly 1996. And Tom, the period 1995 to 1996, with the advent of protease inhibitors in combination with antiretroviral therapy, marked a turning point, transforming HIV from a mostly fatal diagnosis to a manageable chronic condition for those who had access to the medication, those who had housing stability and income. Would you talk about this biomedical breakthrough, your response to it when you heard the news on a personal level, on a political level, what this meant?
Of course, I knew about it objectively. I was close to people in an organization called TAG, Treatment Action Group, which was an offshoot of ACT UP that worked on pure science and trying to get drugs into bodies of people that were unable to get even experimental drugs. But for me, it was very hard to transition from I'm going to get sick and die tomorrow to I'm going to get sick, I'll live for a couple of months, I'll get sick, I'll live for a couple of years. It really was not, what I really noticed when I think back is I stopped going to as many funerals, and it was not until 1998 when I got elected to the Senate, I remember exactly where I was, in City Hall, on the staircase, and I thought, oh my gosh, I might live a long time. I better sign up for that pension program, you know what I mean? Because I had, and to this day, it is I still have difficulty thinking long term. I really live like, of course now I'm over the age where that's actually true for other reasons, but it was such a sea change. And I think of the funerals I went to in 1995. One of them was one of my very best friends who was at death by suicide because he was ill. And also, if any of you have seen Rent, there's a young woman named Pam Shaw who, like Alison Gertz, her first sexual experience with a boy, she contracted HIV and she died in 1995. And she's mentioned when they go around that circle in Rent. And those are among the 1995 funerals that I remember because they were at the end. There'd been so many before, but those really, stick out because they were the most recent and not exactly the final ones, because not everybody got access right away, but people did eventually get access. And again, there are many, many long-term survivors. I'm out about it, but I know I am the keeper of the secret of thousands of people, literally, and I will go to my grave not telling anyone about their HIV status, because as I used to say in the Senate, who would hire me? I'm expensive, right? Families still throw their, kids out. You can't rent an apartment often. So people really keep that information to themselves. The stigma is really alive and well, even here in liberal New York City. When I had to do it all over again when I went to the Senate. When I first got there was a senator who didn't want to shake my hand. That's how ignorant they are. So there is still, it also makes me just weep about the elimination of all of the programs for USAID and all of the people living with, who are now denied life-saving medication, which, by the way, is really terrible because it only makes it so there'll be even worse strains that will eventually come here, and we're all going to suffer because of it. So the battle goes on. And AIDS is a metaphor for many things having to do with healthcare and discrimination and class discrimination.
One thing that strikes me about the oral history recollections is those reflecting about attending funerals, members of ACQC, and the grief and the stigma. Sometimes there would be no family members there because they were ostracized by their families. They never came out, or they were said to have died of pancreatic cancer or diabetes or something, leukemia too. Really heartbreaking. So again, I really invite you to, immerse yourself in these oral history recollections. And I want to give the last word to the students here before audience Q&A, and just ask you to reflect about your work on this project in a broader sense, lessons learned, maybe skills developed, and challenges that you experienced. So I want to give you the opportunity for the last word before we turn it over to the audience. Let's start with, I think, Matthew, Sophia, and then Isabella.
Well, first off, it was an honor to be part of the project. I think one of the many challenges was definitely to be in their footsteps, trying to understand. And through all the stories that we read through as a collective, as a group, before interviewing, it was quite eye-opening, to say the least, quite personal, and I just wanted to, I guess, appreciate the stories that were told from the people I interviewed, and how much I respect for them trying to fight for their beliefs, trying to fight for who they are, basically, for themselves. And yeah, I just wanted to give a shout out for that specifically. And overall, it was quite a really personal journey, quite a personal journey, learning about this important historical time period. And it was definitely rewarding at the end, completing this project. It was definitely not easy. It was very complex.
There are two things that I want to say. I'm going to touch on civil disobedience and the funerals. So Bernard Lynch told me the story. So when you're talking about like funerals and like your friends passing away because like the government literally doesn't care, or there's like no resources to give them, it's really heartbreaking. But one thing about all the individuals that we interviewed and the people who helped you guys in your journey is how incredibly resilient they were. And so Bernard Lynch told the story of this, that one of his friends who passed away, they did his like funeral service in a gay bar in Chelsea, and they buried him like in all his bondage, like just full like chains, like the suspenders, like everything. And he also shared this other saying with me, that when he left the church, he was just really heartbroken because the church is supposed to be like an institution that like cares for people, and they do ministry work and they like pray for people who are like dying, but people who are part of their community, other Catholics, are dying because they're literally like kicking them out, or they just don't want LGBTQ members like part of their parish. And he said that Jesus reminds us to tell the truth, and the church, they perpetuate that story to follow Jesus's footsteps, but nobody tells you that they're going to crucify you when you actually do decide to take the steps to do that. And it's just really ironic and backwards, and it's kind of really messed up. And then the second thing that I wanted to say was that Patrick McGovern, I believe it was him, he told a story about how, or maybe, yeah, I think it was Patrick McGovern. Somebody also in his parish was diagnosed with AIDS, and they were really ashamed. And he was like in his room in the ward, like in his bed, and he told Patrick, like, don't look at me, don't come near me, like I have sinned, like I'm gay and now I'm paying the price. And pretty sure it was Patrick McGovern, but it could have been
It was Charles
Bernard.
King.
Oh, it was Charles King. Yeah, he said that wouldn't be true, Father, because I would be in that bed next to you if it were true, if it were a sin to be gay. And he laid with him and spent time with him until he ultimately passed away. And then the other thing that I was going to say about civil disobedience that ties into education, like Marjorie Hill, Tom Duane, Bernard Lynch, like all the people that we interviewed, you guys were not afraid. You guys stood like against like the police and stuff, specifically at the St. Patrick's Cathedral protest, where like a bunch of people were basically arrested for being on church on a Sunday and like talking about the well-being of other people. And we need people who are like not afraid to do things like that so that real change can happen. And one thing from this experience that I learned is that I just want to tell I want to tell all my peers about this so that we understand what we have to do, because unfortunately the world is still the same place. There's still discrimination, there's still stigma. People are really comfortable with just like racism and injustice, and we have to be the ones to do it. And it's really scary, and like perhaps you will get arrested, perhaps you will be shunned by your community members, but it's all for the greater good. And then what I was gonna finally tie it in with was that education is like equally as important when you're doing things like protesting and building community and civil disobedience. Because like Charles King, he went to Yale Law School, and like he was able to go back and forth with like the police officers, and like he was there in court, and he knew nothing was gonna happen to him, like you know, after the whole thing was done. And I guess I'll end it with like a funny story that kind of like ties into the irony of life. The officer that arrested him asked him out on a date afterwards. So yeah, it's just like society is really a crazy place, and I will always cherish this. As a huge like sociology nerd, this was like probably like the best experience ever, and I'll write about it in the future, and you'll hear about it. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. I just want to say one of the first things that I really really appreciated in this interviews was the amount of underdogs we interviewed and how many people who haven't had their stories told and haven't had their perspectives told. When everyone is so important that we've interviewed, but it was really monumental having people who have never really been interviewed and never had their stories told, which I think was really monumental. And just a lot of the reflections that we had in the interviews were absolutely amazing. One of my favorite parts was when I interviewed Ronald Johnson, and he spoke about his partner who passed away from AIDS, and that was a really sentimental moment in the interview, which I'm just so grateful that I was able to experience it and hold that space for him, and just hearing so many important stories that have never been told before, and I will cherish this experience for a long time. So I truly thank you.
Stephen is the GOAT. He's actually the GOAT. Like I meet people at other events that know him, and they talk about him just as highly as we do. Like, this was such an overwhelming experience, but he broke it down and made it like so manageable, and like we're really grateful to you. Yeah, really grateful.
Thank you, thank you. It was such an honor to work with you three too. A great experience for me. Thank you.